ambulance. At approximately 9:23 a.m., while en route to the hospital, the individual became combative and attacked a paramedic that was riding in the back of the ambulance. The individual pinned the paramedic against the inside wall of the ambulance. The paramedic was able to slip out of the side door of the ambulance and flee. The individual followed them outside into the middle of the 1300 block of North Capitol Street Northeast. Officers following the ambulance became aware of the individual fleeing from the ambulance, and they exited their police vehicles to assist. While outside of the ambulance, the individual pushed one of the officers several times in an attempt to resist from being placed back into the ambulance. The officer attempted to stop the assaulted behavior by deploying OC spray and giving verbal commands. The OC spray did not take effect, and the individual fled from the officers, and he ran into traffic in a 1300 block of North Capitol Street Northwest. While fleeing from the officers, the individual crawled underneath a truck that was stopped in traffic. The individual emerged from underneath of the truck, and he had what appeared to be a metal object clutched in his hand. The involved officer and the witness officer gave multiple commands to the individual to drop it. The individual refused and ran towards the involved officer with the object raised. The officer retreated backwards and again directed the individual to drop the metal object. The individual charged towards the officer, grabbed at him, and swung the metal object. At that time, the officer discharged his firearm, striking the individual. The individual that was struck by the involved officer's gunfire fell to the ground and dropped the object. Officers requested emergency medical assistance from the DC Fire and EMS. However, the individual was later pronounced deceased on the scene. The metal object was recovered from the scene. We have posted the videos to our community briefing page on the MPD's website. And with that, I'll take some questions.
After an incident and outcome like this, are you considering changes to crisis intervention training and policies?
Sure. As part of this, of the investigation into this incident, we'll review all the facts and evidence that's available. There will be recommendations that will be made, and as part of any use of force investigation, it will go to our use of force review board, who will review everything, all the testimonial evidence, the physical evidence, and they'll make recommendations. Types of things that can come out of that are policy changes or additional training. Yes, ma'am.
Chief, I'm not too sure if you already shared this, but what can you share about the officer who fired his weapon when it comes to training?
Sure. So the officer who's involved, he is trained as a crisis intervention officer. What that means is he has an additional 40 hours of training specializing in how to deal with individual folks that are inside a mental health crisis. Additionally, he is an auxiliary member of our emergency response team, crisis negotiation team. Those individuals have additional training on top of that of how to deal with individuals that are in crisis in situations, high-risk situations like barricades and other incidents. Yes, sir.
You have this sort of training, and the idea is to de-escalate. What is your response then to any concerns about a death resulting and hopefully de-escalating, especially with someone going through a mental health crisis?
Sure. So any death is tragic, especially in a circumstance like this where the officer spent so much time trying to work with the individual and get them the help that he needed. With that being said, that the officer does also have to make sure that he protects himself and the community that's out there. So it's a very difficult situation, and obviously the goal is always to try to de-escalate and to safely get that person the help that they need. Sure, Peter.
Again, the family of Mr. Brooks told us that his mother was with him and the officers. They were trying to talk to him at the 7-Eleven. And she urged them to do an involuntary commitment, which might have put more restraints or with the officer in the ambulance. Is there any consideration to doing involuntary commitment?
Sure. So part of the investigation will be to determine how the individual was transported. Was it a voluntary transport or was it an involuntary transport? Obviously, depending on which one of those it was, there are certain procedures and protocols that should have been in place, and that will be part of the investigation.
If it was an involuntary commitment would require the officer riding in the ambulance in restraints?
A person who is involuntarily committed, they are in police custody, so they are in restraints, and there's an officer that has to be with them because they're in custody.
Was this person in restraints?
Sure. In this incident, the individual was not in restraints.
Chief?
Yes, sir.
Could you tell us anything about the metal object? Could you describe it?
Sure. So in the video itself, the picture of the metal object and how the metal object was used by the individual towards the officers, all displayed in there. Additionally, the video does highlight the area with the metal object and what the individual does. It appears to be some sort of metal gauge or tire gauge.
Did any of the officers believe it was a gun?
Obviously, part of the investigation will be to interview the officers and determine what they saw and what they believed and what they felt. At this time in the stage of the investigation, there is no statements from the officers, so we have no idea to know what they believed it was.
What's the threshold for use of force?
Sure, so use of force depends on the threat that the member is presented. So the threshold for deadly use of force is there has to be an imminent or an immediate threat of serious bodily injury or death to the member or to a member of the public.
Is that subjective, or is there like a metric?
Sure, so there's a departmental policy on when you can use deadly force that outlines all of that, and it's also based on the constitutional requirements of force.
So as far as interaction with people wielding weapons, mind you, every situation is different. What options does an officer have as far as, exhausting every possible, option before using deadly force?
Sure. So there's a decision-making matrix on the use of force of depending on the type of threat the officer is presented to the type of option there to respond to that. So it really depends on what type of force or resistance the officer is presented to how they can respond and what is available within department policies to respond to that.
Based on all the additional training this officer had, were there any other de-escalation measures that he could have taken that he didn't?
Sure. I mean, and that's going to be part of the investigation. Again, we're 5 days out, and we don't have all the evidence. There is the criminal review that will take place first, but we'll look into all that to see, what did the officer, all the measures that were taking place, are there other things that could have been done, or are there other types of training or tools or things that we can use in the future to mitigate, things like this. So that's all part of the investigation.
Chief, we've been asked a million times, but was there any consideration by the officers to call DBH during the talks with them?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the officer who was involved in this incident, he is a crisis negotiator officer. He was, not only is he a negotiator officer, but he's also a crisis intervention officer. So he is actually trained by DBH, receiving 40 hours of training. But there was no additional request for DBH training from MPD.
Chief,
Sure.
what is the status of officers being issued tasers? Where is MPD on that? Is the goal to have every officer equipped with a taser?
Sure. So right now where we're at with that is all sergeants have tasers. There are a few sergeants that are in non-patrol situations that do not have them. Additionally, some of our field training officers do have tasers. And that's something that we look at, the availability of tasers and other less than lethal weapons that are options in situations like this and other situations as well.
So is there a goal to get everybody with a taser, or are you just kind of where you're at now and this is where you're going to stay?
So right now we've actually increased the number of individuals that have tasers. Initially when we rolled them out, it was only sergeants that have them. So we've actually increased the population that have tasers, and we'll continue to evaluate that.
And was there a taser on, was any officer at the scene armed with a taser at this incident?
So I have no information that any officer on the scene had a taser.
So I just want to clear one thing up. Crisis intervention training is 40 hours. Crisis negotiation, is that an additional 40 or additional 80 hours? So was it 80 hours?
Sure. So crisis intervention officer, that's an additional 40 hours. The involved individual in this case, he's also an auxiliary negotiator. That's an additional at least 80 hours, and there's subsequent trainings above that.
So he at least has 120 hours.
And potentially, he may have more as well.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Chief, what was going on through your head as you watched the final moments of that footage?
I mean, I think it's a very tragic situation. An individual who's obviously in a mental health crisis, it's tragic for him, it's tragic for his family, it's tragic for the community. The officers that are involved, I mean, you can see they're trying to stop traffic, they're trying to stop the truck. You can hear in the officer's voice of him pulling back. So, I mean, I think it's a terrible outcome overall, and I think it's a tragedy for everyone involved.
Of course, the use of force it's all being reviewed, but what are your thoughts and how do you assess when we heard those 5 gunshots, the guy gets on the ground and then you heard the final and 6th gunshot? Warranted? What do you think?
Sure. So again, every round that an officer discharges from his firearm or every type of force that's used has to be accounted for and has to be judged against our departmental policy. So each one of those rounds that were discharged will be evaluated against the policy, and a determination will be made, was it in or was it without. They did happen in a very short period of time, and obviously, as you can see from at least the vantage point of the video that we have from the officer, the individual was approaching very quickly and was, slashing or coming towards him in a slashing manner. So of course that happens very quickly, and decisions have to be made in a split-second decision.
So an object like a tire gauge, if it's being used in a slashing manner, it could be confused with a knife, or?
Yeah, I can't get into what the officer thought. Obviously, we haven't interviewed him to get his, what his belief was. So I can't really comment on what he thought it was or what believed it was. Any additional questions?
Chief, can I ask if there's any update on the gentleman yesterday who was shot in New Carrollton? If you know particularly anything about the weapons that he had, how he got those weapons, what might have sparked this?
There's really nothing more than what we have yesterday, Mark. What I will say about that is, officer-involved shootings in the state of Maryland are investigated under the authority of the Attorney General's office, so they have that officer-involved shooting investigation. We are working with them in relation to those firearms and the connections through NIBIN and other means, forensic means, to link them back to our case. So there's really nothing new on that. We do expect to have more information on that as the investigation is ongoing out in Maryland and the evidence is processed.
Do you still investigate the homicide, despite the fact that the suspect is dead?
We will, because we want to make sure that we have all the evidence. And I mean, there's no indication that there's anyone else involved, but we still want to do a thorough and complete investigation.
Like the chief saying about what happened last Wednesday, of course you can't speak for her, but just in terms of conversations that she had.
Sure.
At higher ups, what are her thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I can't speak for the chief, what she personally believes, but I can tell you the conversations that the chief and I have had, she too, I mean, this is a very tragic situation for everyone involved. We all share that sentiment. No one wants to be seeing an individual of our community that's shot by an officer doesn't want to be in that situation. It's tragic for the officer, it's tragic for the individual, his family, and the overall community. And, the chief shares that sentiment, and she wishes she could be here with you right now to relay that.
What does this do as far as potentially diminishing, public trust in officers, as it relates to them being able to respond to situations people aren't messing with health right?
Sure. No, absolutely. I mean, that's something we think about. I mean, our interactions with the community, every interaction we have, right, the goal is to try to build trust and relationships with the community. When we have situations like this, it is definitely a challenge that's out there and things for us to work through. We are continuing to always evaluate our response in ways that we can do better, and that's why things like this, 10 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now in this setting. The ability to go through this and be as transparent as possible at this stage in the investigation and provide as much information that we can. That's what we want to put out there to make sure that we can share what we can in the video that we do have. Transparency is important to the community.
And as far as transparency is concerned, my understanding was just perusing through social media, some of the activist organizations at the initial press conference were denied entry. They were trying to inquire further about the situation. What potential is there, to include them or to make these press conferences, more open to members of the public who are working to build more accountability for the police?
No, absolutely. That's a very fair question. And one of the things that we do is we invite in the media to share this, to put it out to a wider audience. We share our press conferences and our information on our social media page. But that was also an issue that was brought to my attention. It's something that we're going to make sure that we do incorporate those individuals when we have those press conferences in the future on the scene.
What's the timeline on that?
Well, I mean, the goal is for if we have another situation or another press conference on the scene, we'll just make sure it's open to everybody. So we don't really have a timeline. It should be now. Sir.
Who rendered first aid? Did it happen to be the same paramedic who left the ambulance?
I don't have that information. I don't know off the top of my head.
Soon after that he was.
Yes, it was. And DC Fire and EMS were right there on the scene within moments. All right, with that, thank you all very much. I appreciate your time. Thanks.
Everybody, thanks again for the time. Last minute, it does appear it's the same ambulance crew that rendered assistance
As far as that matrix with the use of force, where can I find it?
online. So it's under an MPD general order, so if you just Google MPD use of force policy, it's there. Anything else, Attorney Vic?
Well, just generally, I mean, he calls it a use of force for